Hello everyone, we're on now to Module 5 of Understanding Violence and Conflict, and the topic for this week is non-violence. And since we've spent the last few weeks, a third of the course already, talking about violence, it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about what the alternatives are and strategies that can be used that are not going to, hopefully, not going to escalate violence, and use non-violent techniques. So I'll have a bit of a quick overview in the study guide of the historical uses of non-violent philosophies. We'll look at the balance of individual and organisational strategies that become part of non-violence, because it's not just a big movement, it's also a case of individual non-violent strategies that can be used. We'll look at some safety considerations for these interventions, and we'll have a bit of a look at de-escalation as it relates to physical violence. We've spoken a little bit so far on escalation, generally speaking. It's useful to look at what are some techniques to try and de-escalate physical violence rather than just de-escalate conflict generally. All right, so a quick commentary. All of this, of course, is in your study guide for this week. In terms of the history of non-violence, there's an excellent chapter by Gene Sharp that's your set reading, your guided reading for this week, which gives you a very good historical and philosophical overview of non-violent struggle. So I won't preempt that, just to say that Gene Sharp is renowned as one of the sort of leading figures in non-violent struggle, and his work has become increasingly relevant recently as the Occupy movement, for example, drew very heavily on his ideas, and where it's very easy to write off some non-violent people as people who are just subject to their own beliefs and commitments and morality. Sharp is quite open about being a pragmatist, that you can get a lot more done with non-violence than you can with violence. Violence generally just perpetuates violence, and a violence against a stronger authority figure will just simply give them excuse to crack down on everyone else. So Sharp has got some very strong but very pragmatic ideas about why you use non-violence, particularly against a stronger opponent. And a lot of the discussion here, of course, is about social movements, and it's on that big scale. Not so much. There's not so much discussion about it on the smaller conflict scales, which is interesting. And I suppose mediation is of itself a non-violent form of conflict resolution. So yeah, a lot of the topics we're going to talk about are large groups of people resisting governments and those sort of things, rather than individuals involved in mid-level skirmishes amongst each other. But we can draw some conclusions, we can look at some of the ideas that come out of it. There's a bit of a discussion of the ideas of positive and negative peace, and that gives the point that something that might appear to be peace may not be peaceful at all. The absence of overt violence may not be peace, it may be quite oppressive. So that's worthy of exploration, as are the criticisms of non-violence. So we're not just going to accept it at face value. There have been some very pertinent criticisms of non-violence as a tactic to solve problems, particularly problems that require direct intervention. Certainly there's been a feminist critique that non-violence has been very ineffective as a response to male violence, particularly family violence, saying turning the other cheek and whatever is not necessarily going to help. I don't know that is actually non-violence, though. I think there are plenty of non-violent solutions to family violence that don't involve just being disempowered. And I think sometimes some of the criticisms of non-violence are, willfully or accidentally misinterpreting what non-violence is about. And non-violence certainly involves use of force, and certainly allows you to respond and not just passively take violence. And you can use force to protect people and to remove them from a situation in a way that doesn't involve attacking the opposition. So have a bit of a read of those criticisms, have a bit of a think about those. And I think, like a lot of things, a lot of the critiques are mired in stereotypes and that idea that people who advocate non-violence are the kind of hippy-dippy, passive kind of martyrs who will let themselves get victimised for the greater good. And Sharp is very clear about that not being the case. And I think it's very important to think beyond those sort of stereotypes. And I understand the desire to respond with violence in many cases, but history has tended to prove that particularly where the powerful have control over media, control over ideology, that it's generally the powerful have the ability to reinterpret that violence in the public domain as something that's terrible. And the clear example recently with the non-violent Black Lives Matters protests and the Trump administration constantly referring to them as terrorism, calling in the FBI's unmarked vans, and conflating a lot of what went on and calling things violent that were non-violent resistance. So when people are actually violent, and it's bad enough when you're being non-violent and you just get reinterpreted through the media as acting with violence, but it's much, much easier to do when you actually are having examples of violence to draw on. So there's a bit of a discussion in the next section on the strategies to use as forms of non-violent resistance. Again, these are largely aimed at activists and at larger scale social conflicts, but it's worth having a look at these, particularly Sharp's 23 applications of non-violence and his 198 methods of non-violent action. You probably won't have time to read all of those. But some of these do have implications at the smaller conflict scale as well. So it does help us redefine power in many ways, and to look at sometimes when you think in a conflict the power goes in a certain direction, there are certain things that the party that seems to be powerless can do to dig their heels in to resist, that may be a bargaining chip that they hadn't really counted on. There's also a bit of discussion. I went a little off topic talking about mutual aid and autonomous zones, because these are all things that have come out of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I just think they're worth touching on as a discussion and as part of the broader context. Kropotkin's idea of mutual aid is particularly interesting, and really looking at what the precepts of anarchism are outside of the stereotypes we get of anarchists being destructive. When we look at anarchy being about decentralised structures and about emergent structures that come out of communities that support, mutual aid is a very interesting idea, and it's something that tends to get proven again and again and again. At times when there's disasters and governments are being ineffective, generally communities will pull together and will help each other out in ways that are very positive. And mutual aid draws on that to say, well, maybe sometimes the role of government is to support those emergent mutual aid options as they come up, and not to get in the way of them at least. Okay, put a bit of a section next on safety practices in dealing with non-violence and non-violence resistance. That's more in there out of my own sense of responsibility, that if I'm advocating or at least discussing and raising these ideas, the flip side is the responsibility of giving safety options to people. So we're not just saying go out and do non-violent action, that we actually cover those things as well. And that's the safety side as well. And that's relevant in terms of organisationally as well, because sometimes organisations will organise resistance on a bigger scale. It's not just a case of an individual or groups of individual protesters. Sometimes groups will organise boycotts and those sorts of things, will organise physical activities in resistance, and being aware of those important safety issues is important. It's a priority for me in these areas. All right, and the next section we've got another short section on de-escalating physical violence. This is a really important part of the course. I wish I had more to offer you in this area, because it's one area that I have seen significant problems in law enforcement and security. And a lot of the violence that I've seen in various places and scuffles between police, security and other people often come from the authority figures not being terribly good at de-escalating violence. And I'm sure this is something that is taught in the police academy, but I don't know that there's enough of it taught. And so I've pulled out some things online about de-escalation. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a huge amount of useful stuff there, and unfortunately a lot of the things I found about de-escalating violence and self-defense were only 2 steps away from preppers, and some of them were only 2-3 steps away from some pretty awful racist content as well. So I found it pretty much impossible to recommend those ones to you folks. I checked the context in which these people were talking about self-defense. So yeah, it's one of those things that if you find good resources, please share them with me, and I'll share them with everyone else as well, because I think it's a really important area, and I'm a little bit surprised there's not a lot more attention put to this. I know my Wing Chun instructor puts a lot of emphasis on de-escalation, and maybe I'll ask him in the future to do a video on his beliefs around that as well. But and you know yourself when you see a conflict starting and everyone's just getting more and more agitated, and you know it's going to kick off at some point. What are the strategies to bring it back down? And certainly putting your hand on your gun and saying, sir, will you step down? Sir, I'm warning you, is not going to de-escalate anything. And that's unfortunately what a lot of police officers do in those circumstances. And I don't believe that's what the academy teaches them to do. And if it does, they need to teach them something else. So anyway, we're going to carry on and that discussion a little further in the workshop. And I've got a little bit of a quote there from some of the research around de-escalation in policing that doesn't look at individual practices but looks at broad demographics, and finds that female police officers, generally speaking, much better at de-escalation than male police officers. And we can talk about that a little bit more in the workshop. Some interesting issues there. All right, so the challenges this week, we've got 2 main ones and then a little short discussion. The first one is looking at some of the history of non-violence and the individuals involved. And we're going to look at some, in our small groups, we're going to pick a person to research. The second is looking at body language and violence and trying to identify what are some of the cues around escalation and things you can see that are definitely things to keep an eye out for. And again, we will be sharing some of those ideas, and there's some Google Docs referred to in the notes that you can start putting. When you're in the workshops, you can share your findings on what you think are the cues that someone is de-escalating, and probably the easier ones to spot when someone's escalating a violent situation. And then we'll have just a little quick update on the scenario writing process and my observations about what's happening and where we take it to from the point of being an accessible item through to it being a scenario that will be used by your peers as a scenario that you're going to test your skills and practice on. So that's not going to be a huge part of this, but that'll be a small observation. Now I'll quickly turn to the check-in for last week to see if there's anything I need to pick up on there. The first question was around social movements and whether there needed to be more depth, and the response was yes, please, more depth. So I'll look at developing that in future. Of course, this week we've got the exercise in the challenge that looks at individuals involved in non-violent issues, but it's always something that's it's a bit difficult to predict when you've got a group of students from all over the place. Is how much does everyone know about something like the civil rights movement in the United States? How much do people know about social movements in Australia? I'll take that on board. The systems thinking, people thought it was interesting. Some people thought they would like to learn more, some people didn't. But it's something that we're going to pick up on again. And those of you who are criminology students, there's the Justice Strategies and Alliances unit in third year, which will all be based around a big kind of complex simulation. And systems thinking is a key part of how you respond in that one. And I don't have anything firm to announce about it yet, but it's hopefully going to be exciting and something quite different to what you normally do in a unit of study. Yes. I don't think you have to be a criminology student to do it. If you're a psych student, you might have an elective to do it as well if you're interested. But definitely the Bachelor of Criminology students will be doing that. How confident about the conflict scenario? Slightly confident. Some poor person felt completely out of their depth, but that's okay. Work through the worksheet. Use the randomization where you need to, and yes, this is something you've never done before, but that's what uni is all about: new experiences and new ideas. And the final question about topics to explain in more depth, and the common theme there was power differences, which again we'll come back to. I think next week we're going to talk about power differences again, it is a very interesting area, and there's some guidance and there are some opinions. There's definitely some opinions, but we'll look at the range of different ideas as to, well, how do you recognise these power imbalances and then what do you do about them practically? Alrighty, well that's about it for this time, and I will see you in class next time.